Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. All right, Shannon, it's 12 o'clock. You ready?
I'm ready.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Owen. I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Engagement for the School of Business. And if you signed up for ChatGPT Insights and Implications, you're in the right spot. We had a lot of interest in this and are glad that you are here with us today. We are recording this session. We'll send out the recording afterwards. If you could mute yourselves during Shannon's presentation, we'd appreciate it. And we're thrilled to have Shannon McKeen, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Analytics Impact and a professor of the practice, to facilitate this session for us. Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stacy. I appreciate that. Good afternoon. I guess it is afternoon, everybody. Stacy said, I teach here at Wake Forest. I work in the Center for Analytics Impact. I'm quite bullish on generative AI and ChatGPT, so I'm glad to be able to talk about this topic. Just a little bit of background on me. I spent 25 years in industry. Perhaps most notably, I spent a long time working for Hanes Brands here in Winston-Salem. I also spent some time consulting with Pricewaterhouse. I spent 15 years in academia. Started teaching here about 5 years ago. Have also taught at UNC Chapel Hill, Duke, and at Dartmouth, where I got my MBA. Before we get started, I just want to kind of get a quick range or understanding of kind of where the audience is coming from. So if you could use the hands feature, and I'm going to go through each of these 4 categories, starting with the one on the far right. I've only heard about ChatGPT. Second category, I've tried it. Third category, I used it some, but haven't integrated it. Fourth category, I've incorporated it into my work routine like Google search. So let's do this. Let's use the chat. So put in the chat if you're a 1, you've only heard about it. Or if you're a 2, you've tried it. If you're a 3, you've used it some, but haven't integrated it into your work stream. Or 4, you probably could be giving this talk. Okay, it looks like an average of between 2, maybe 3. So a special request to those that are a 4. I'm going to talk about some things, and you all probably know as well as I do, this is a rapidly changing field. So if I say something that you know has changed, or you've got something to add, by all means, raise your hand, because I think we can all learn from each other, because this is such a fast-moving topic. So for those that were a 1, what is ChatGPT? It is a large-scale language model developed by OpenAI for natural language processing tasks. It's a deep learning model that uses transformer-based architecture. I'm not going to get too deep into the technology behind it or the research behind it, although if someone wants to talk offline about that, I certainly can. Well, the power of it is it's trained on a large corpus of text data, including books, articles, and web pages. That includes Reddit and Wikipedia and all kinds of things. And if you've ever spent any time on Reddit, sometimes there's things on Reddit that aren't true. And so it does a pretty good job of parsing through for things that are, quote, accurate. But one of the things we'll talk about is you need to be pretty discerning in output that you get from ChatGPT or any other generative AI, because the term hallucination, which I'll mention in a moment, is where it provides information to you in a very assertive, confident tone, and it could be totally wrong. I think what makes us want to trust it or believe it, it does respond like humans. And one of the interesting things you can do about it is you can instruct the model for the tone you want to hear back. My best example, I think, is our son is getting a PhD in aerospace engineering, and he has tried on at least 4 occasions to explain to me what his PhD thesis topic is about, and I could not grasp it. I asked ChatGPT to explain the topic to me like I was a 10-year-old, and now I understand what he's doing. So it's a really helpful tool to explain things that may be a little confusing to you, but you do have to make sure you understand or validate that sort of information. A little bit about OpenAI, the firm that launched it. And I should say, when I talk about ChatGPT, I'm talking about the most recent version, 4.0. If you're a student of this, you know there are earlier versions of ChatGPT, but the one that's out there now that powers Bing, the search tool behind at Microsoft, is ChatGPT 4.0. So OpenAI, it's a research company whose mission is to artificial general intelligence is going to benefit all of humanity. It was founded in 2015 as a not-for-profit. Elon Musk was one of the original founders. He has since left the company. Sam Altman is kind of a pundit in the generative AI space, and you may have heard him. He's often on the news or talking. A little bit of guarded culture. Their best-known products are ChatGPT and an image processor called DALL-E. And as you may have seen, they have gotten a pretty big investment from Microsoft. And so a lot of their products are becoming part of Microsoft's suite of services. They are, like their name, they're open. They're all about open access. I mean, there is a fee if you want to use ChatGPT 4 directly as opposed to going through Bing. But a lot of their tools are available to the public. 3.5, which is a great large language model. And you can do most of the things that I'm going to talk about today on the free version of ChatGPT. Some of the examples they give that you could use for an inquiry is, explain quantum computing to me like I'm a 10-year-old. Give me some creative ideas for a 10-year-old's birthday party. It also is really helpful, our students have found, in programming. So particularly if you're familiar in programming in R or perhaps in C++, and you want to take that code and understand how you might write the same instructions but in a new language, and ChatGPT will do that for you. It does remember what you've said if you sign on with a username and password, so that they do keep the information. There's some controversy about either using that to train their models even more. So there are some privacy concerns. I'm a little skeptical of putting any sort of personal information into ChatGPT. I'm a little more on the conservative side, but if you're going to use a tool, that's something you might want to consider. It does allow for follow-up corrections, so you can save the chat and come back to it at a later time. It can give you bad information, like I said. There's actually a article in the Washington Post today that said it's not great if you're looking for facts, because you can get facts wrong, but it's really good for ideas and synthesizing information. And as those of you that are more familiar with it, also ChatGPT is limited to events that happened before 2022. So anything that happened after 2021, it doesn't know about. There are other tools that are aware of what's happening in the world today. That's something to keep in mind. So the canonical example is used if you ask ChatGPT 3.5 about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you probably won't get much information. It's caught on initially in the spring of the year, as I think it first caught my attention in February. But this is something that I saw where someone had measured how long it took for certain digital products to reach 1 million users. So it took Netflix 3.5 years, Facebook 10 months, Instagram 74 days, ChatGPT hit 1 million users in 5 days. So Vladimir Lenin quote, there are decades where nothing happens, there are weeks where decades happen. I happen to be pretty bullish on the tool with certain cautions, and I think if you're not using it on your daily work, you may be missing an opportunity to be more productive on how you do your daily job, and I will talk about that in a moment. It's not the only tool out there. There's a lot of generative AI tools out there, and I've kind of categorized them into 3 groups, kind of AI assistants, image generators, and research and productivity tools. I'm curious, anybody who uses generative AI on a regular basis, Is anybody using one of these tools more regularly than they use ChatGPT? Raise your hand. I'd just love to hear how others are using these tools that may be out there. Richard, I think you said you were an active user. Have you? Are you a ChatGPT user, or do you use something else? Bard, Claude. Okay. So I keep going. Richard?
Yeah, we've used Bing Chat. There are some things we've started to do as a company with ChatGPT, but I'm sure you're going to get into legal implications later, and that's where I'll add what's given us some hesitation.
Actually, that's not on my agenda. So can you touch that right now, so in case I forget?
Well, so we have looked at it for some software development areas. As you alluded to, it is a language learning model, and there are any of these are languages that you're programming in, and we're just not sure where it's taking some information from. So if it is taking from GitHub, but somebody has some rights to it, we want to make sure that we haven't integrated that into our customer facing products. I think where we might get some use out of this is kind of some ideas, or if somebody's stuck, having a brain freeze in terms of some developing some ideas. Hey, they might look to that first. That might get them started on some things. But we're taking a pause on it until we figure out some legal things.
So make sure I understand. So it's just the copyright issues that could be a liability for your company, depending on how it all works out in the end. So some of you may be familiar with something called the Gartner hype curve, and it's just Gartner research likes to look at new technologies, and its research says that it normally tends to follow this overall pattern. Now, there's a lot of variations, but on the y-axis is just expectations by users or by business, and along the x-axis is the passage of time. So what happens is the innovation is triggered somehow. It kind of gets into the general business or pop culture mind. People are really talking about it, peak expectations. People realize, you know what, it's not as great as we thought it was, and then it comes down through a trough of disillusionment, and then slowly it comes back up to a point of productivity. What's interesting is this is the Gartner hype curve for at the end of 2022, and basically generative AI is not even on here. There's causal AI, which may be looking at it, but the point is this really did come out of nowhere for some companies. We had a consulting firm that reached out to us, and they were actually getting a little bit of backlash from their clients, because their clients are like, you're supposed to help us see these things. You're supposed to help us see around corners. Why did you miss this particular boat? And that's not true. Some people saw it coming, but a lot of people did not. So I think, to me, the biggest lesson, if you are not a regular user of this, or are just have tried it, is to keep trying it, because it really is something that only comes with practice. You just start using it as much as you can. So I'm going to go through a couple quick examples of how I first started using it. These are mostly inquiries I put to ChatGPT back in like May and June, but I think they're still relevant as far as an implication or a showcase of what certain ChatGPT specifically, or other generative AI tools can do. So I asked it, tell me what you can do. And it kind of gave me a list, a summary on the left and on the right. It tried to defend why it may be a little bit different from other large language models. At the time, it had a larger scale. It was more nodes, more parameters, multimodal capabilities. You can fine-tune ChatGPT. You can now fine-tune other models as well, including Llama, which comes from Meta. It does allow you to connect things over time, and it was multilingual. For the tech folks in the room, these are some of the innovations that have happened starting back in the 80s all the way through to the transformer that were introduced in 2017, kind of the milestones that allowed the compute power and the programming to produce what generative AI can do. Some of the original uses actually were more in visual computer vision, looking at photographs, and think about how you can create a composite And so this image on the right is a digital output by Dolly, but the different nodes along the way, you can see how it may have changed over time. Like I said, ChatGPT can do a lot of things. We have a new dean here at the business school. She's been here a year now, but I just, as a test, I said, write an email welcoming the new dean to the business school, and it spit out that text on the left. I also was wondering how it might help me as an instructor, and I asked it to prepare slide headlines for a PowerPoint presentation on how to sell, and it spit out those 10 things. I asked it for a meeting agenda. Give me a purpose and an agenda for a decision-making meeting and whether our company should purchase new AI productivity software, and it laid it out. One thing that I will say based on my own experience, and I'm curious if anyone else in the audience has said this, is that if you're using it for a topic you know nothing about, it's pretty impressive, because I'm not a history buff. And so if I would ask it to give me a history of Germany's role in World War II in 1,000 words, I'd probably be pretty impressed with what it has to say because I'm not that knowledgeable about it. But when I ask it questions on things I think I'm pretty knowledgeable about, I realize that oftentimes it's somewhat superficial. And so it's really through interacting with it can I get beyond that superficial nature of it and actually get real meat out of it. So be very careful of what some people call one and done. You input a prompt, you take back what it spits out and use it. That's not the best use of any of these tools. It's a little time consuming, but I think the return is there. It's a little more productive, and you get more value if you're interacting with the tool. Anybody in the audience have similar experience or a counter experience to that? I have to look to my right to see who's got their hands up, or put it in the chat. Okay, so you can help it design spreadsheets. I said create a spreadsheet for attendance, and it gave me a simple template. I could interact with it and say, okay, thanks for that. I want a little more detail. And oh, by the way, here's a CSV file with all the students in my class. And it would create a file that I could start using to track attendance in a class. Designing a process. This is one of those categories. I spent a lot of time working at marketing when I was at Haynes, where I could be a little more discerning and realize that when I asked it for the process for building a global marketing campaign, the 8 steps that it spit out were pretty good, and I would say they're accurate, but I would want to go much deeper with that. And you can do that by interacting with it. Back to the idea of avoiding the one and done. I might say, I don't know how well you could read that, but the 7th step is launch the campaign. Launch your campaign across different markets, channels, and languages, and monitor its performance closely. Make adjustments as necessary to improve results and achieve your goals. I can say to it, okay, on the 7th step, can you go a little deeper on what that means? What if I'm only doing a few markets? You can really kind of have it work with you, have you think of it as a partner that you would use like a colleague to brainstorm ideas with. I mentioned coding. The example on the right says, show the R code and Python code for removing duplicates in a data set. Fairly simple instruction, but you can ask it a lot more complicated instructions. I've actually found it pretty useful for Excel formulas. I started using Excel 25 years ago, and I'm not nearly as sophisticated with some of the new functions, some of the new tools, and I have found that ChatGPT or other generative AI models can be quite helpful in identifying the formulas that may help me do some Excel functions more quickly. I wanted to outline an article on leadership. I asked it to write a poem about the meaning of life. My daughter's a poet. She said that wasn't such a good poem, but it was not a bad start. I asked it for some insights. Back to the history, I asked, summarize why Germany lost World War II. I didn't show it here, but here, one of the ideas it presents for why Germany lost World War II. The second one was strategic mistakes. I went and said, okay, go deeper on what strategy mistakes Germany actually made. And I got some pretty interesting answers. thinking about my job, the learning outcomes for a class, I said, drafts learning outcomes for a course on prescriptive analytics. Now, my learning outcomes for that class, I think, a little bit better, but it did give me an idea of something I perhaps should beef up as far as learning outcomes and what might come of that. Creating test questions, developing personal strategies, give me some best practices for dealing with someone with dementia. Brainstorming, that's one of the things that can really do well. I asked brainstorm names for a potential AI product that will make you more productive by improving your ability to learn, write, and brainstorm. Idea articles, it's really great at summarizing. This is an article that two colleagues and I wrote about experiential learning in an MSBA program for an Informs magazine. And, my prompt was TLDR, too long didn't read, and it gave me, probably 200 words explaining what's in that article. And then my favorite, my first use of generative AI was, I have two kids in their 20s, and I'm always annoying them with dad jokes. So I got some great dad jokes to show. So enough of examples. I want to talk a little about some of the risks, and Richard mentioned this a little bit. It's not autonomous. You have to be very thoughtful of what you give it in order to give you input back. This is a simple flowchart that this professor came up with in 2023 to ask the question, is it safe to use ChatGPT for your task? And I use it, and I encourage students to use it. If the output is okay, if it's not true, then you want to be more careful. How are you going to verify its accuracy? And if you can't verify it, then you probably shouldn't use it. If you can verify it, you should probably use it. It's pretty simple. And the reason you want to do that is because of this thing called hallucinations. It's a term used whenever a user is misled because the answer provided was incorrect, or the system says it with great confidence. This number's dropped a little bit, but early on, it was estimated that ChatGPT may hallucinate 20% of the time. I think it's down below 10% now, but it's a risk and something you need to be careful about. And you've probably seen the same news stories I have about people that have taken what a generative AI model spits out and used it as in a document or legal proceeding, and have ultimately got themselves in trouble. This is an early example where I asked it, if I'm in London, that implies I'm in England. But if I left London, does that mean I left England? And it told me I had left England. So again, this will not work today. If I put the same prompt into ChatGPT today, it will not hallucinate. But this is an example of an early hallucination. If you are using it at work or in any sort of capacity, then attribution is important. This is particularly important for us here in academia. We want to be really sure that our students and our staff and our faculty are documenting use and explaining how they're using it. A colleague here has a good phrase, is that it's most powerful when it helps you do your work, not do the work for you. So back to the one and done and taking output and passing it off as your own. So whatever your organization might have, it's always good to let people know that that you're using the tools.
Shannon, someone had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
that's okay. Yeah. Stephanie had a question.
Stephanie, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, I missed you.
Hi. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Please.
I'm very interested in the risk that you're speaking about. I'm the director of corporate technology solutions at Compass Group USA, and I do all technology contracting for the vendor management office. Do a lot of work with HR and their technology solutions. And as you know, we've gotten more and more AI requests in these contracts that are all very different. And the risk is all very different depending on how much the AI learns or changes or whatever. Do you have a suggestion on how to prevent AI from creating bias or discrimination, particularly in the AI field with candidates or job descriptions or postings? Is just to help from a contractual standpoint, and also when I'm vetting vendors on if we want to use their solution, we're just kind of new in the game of the process. We're starting to ask for bias assessments. We have an AI governance committee. but maybe a little bit more about the risk and how to protect your company from that risk?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And for those that may not be following that closely, as Stephanie mentioned, because the models are trained on text or information that others have written, then those that wrote that original text may have had a bias, and that bias can be integrated into the model. And I saw a really good example the other day in an advertising class where somebody asked a image generator to generate, 50 images of a car and driver, and 49 of them were men in the car, and there was only one with a woman. And so clearly that model had some bias in it, thinking that men were more likely to drive than women, which is not true. So to your question, Stephanie, I think it sounds like the governance, the auditing that may happen, making sure that your suppliers are trying to do the same auditing and governance. At this stage, I don't know if there's a foolproof way of getting bias out, but the intention of seeking it and trying to prevent it from happening is probably, with language in the contracts, all that you can really do. I'm curious if anyone else on the call has more experience with Stephanie's question and may have a point of view.
Well, I think one thing we are looking at is hey, training that model on our own, data that we have cultivated, that we trust, versus data that whatever ChatGPT had trained it on. But you've got to decide: are you willing to take on that effort? Do you have enough of the data to do so? And do you have the infrastructure to do so? Because some of these large language models do take quite a bit of compute power to do so.
And I'm curious, Richard, are you fine-tuning an existing model with your own data, or are you building a whole model of your own?
I actually can't talk about what we're doing.
Okay, fair enough. That's fair enough.
But
okay.
I could talk about what some of my clients are looking to train on their own data, and even taking it to whole different lengths. So, I mean, we've talked about, or Sham's talked about languages, and that could extend not just to English or any spoken language, but programming languages. Well, I've got one client who's publicly talked about, as they try and recruit, that, hey, if chemistry and biology are the languages of drug development, drug discovery, they want to start training models with that language. I know they're in their very early stages, but I'm excited to see what she and her PhDs come up with.
So I think, stepping back a moment, as this slide says in the bottom of that text, this is kind of an overused analogy, but for someone who has not spent much time with generative AI, you're using a version of it already if you use any sort of text or email software that tries to predict the next word. So at its base level, that's what generative AI does, is by looking through all these data sets, it provides probabilities of what could be the next word in the sentence. Today's weather is blank, and nice, bad, cloudy, snowy, stormy, whatever. And so it will fill that next word in, but on steroids, as far as thinking much further than just the next word, thinking about the context of the whole conversation. I think it's going to be a huge productivity enhancer. I think if used appropriately, it's really going to make people more productive. I'm seeing it in the classroom, where it used to take me 45 minutes to an hour to create a quiz for a article or for a series of articles I wanted the students to read. I can use a generative AI and I can create a draft of that quiz in less than 10 minutes. And I can spend my time actually fine-tuning those questions to make sure it's specifically getting at the content that I want. And I can make sure, again, using it as a partner back and forth. And so that's just a small example where I think the productivity will go up significantly. And then I have more time to spend with the students, or thinking about new material, or thinking about more recent material that I can use in the classroom to make the point. Anybody have any examples from there, particularly those that are using it regularly, where it's really enhanced their productivity? People are worried about, at least in the press, people are talking about, is it going to take jobs away? I really don't think it's going to take away that many jobs. Interestingly enough, there was some research done in a call center with using a generative AI tool, and the productivity enhancement that was achieved was greater for those that were on the low productivity scale. So if you were an awesome call center, meeting all your meeting all your metrics and stuff like that, then using the generative AI tool might have increased your productivity like 8%. But if you were mediocre or a below average call center performance employee, then the tool really makes you that much more productive. So another colleague likes to say, you don't have to, at least in the near term, you don't need to be worrying about AI taking your job, but you might want to worry about someone using AI taking your job if you're not staying abreast of what the capability is for the tool. So when I think about, this is a stretch, but I go back to, I'm old enough to know the advent of spreadsheets and what that did for at least the businesses I've been part of. It was a huge productivity enhancer, as well as GPS and map. It's amazing. My kids can't read a map, which is a loss, and I'm worried about that. But they're that much more effective, and they don't get lost because they've got Google Maps or Waze or Apple Maps or whatever. So, what does that mean for AI? What is AI literacy? It's understanding how to use the tools and making sure the tools are right for the tasks. It means being responsible and understanding, to Stephanie's question about exactly what are the risks from a bias or privacy standpoint or an accuracy standpoint, and making sure that we're using it in a fair and equitable manner. Authenticity, making sure we don't lose the human element, making sure, again, using the tool to help you do your work, not do your work for you, and using it to make your job more productive and more efficient. Occasionally I read articles about folks that, are saying, I'm using it at work, but I don't dare tell my boss because I'm worried that they'll think I'm using it appropriately, or they'll think they don't need me because the AI can do the tool. This is a quote from the McKinsey article: substitute sometimes, complement often. So again, the idea of using it to complement your work and not just to be a replacement for it. Again, thinking back to the past, this is not the first time that technology shifts have affected the way we think, work. Calculators, I don't know, slides. I remember slideshows when I was a kid of our vacations, and I don't even know. Probably slides don't exist these days unless it's some very technical applications, as well as maps and how to read maps. I dug up this article from, I think it's like 1965, math teachers protesting against calculator use. A lot of conversation at school about what's the appropriate use for generative AI in the classroom. And it goes back to that idea of, is it helping the students learn, or are they replacing it and using it to cheat? And so for calculator use, if the course is about doing long division and doing multiplication tables, then they shouldn't be using a calculator. If it's about use accounting or uses where the calculator makes them more efficient, then I would, in 65, I would have been all for calculator use. So a theme that I have is experimentation, whether it's an individual or as a company. I think you should familiar yourself with these tools, the free ones. You should, try trial and error. It can be frustrating. There are situations where it doesn't work as well as it could, but you really learn a lot. And it's only from this trial and error that I've got any sort of comfort level with using the tools. Ethan Mollick is a professor at Wharton, and he specifically talks a lot about AI in education. And he advocates that we think about AI in 7 different ways: as a tutor, as a coach, as a mentor, as a teammate, as a tool, as a simulator, and as a student. I'm looking at Scott's question right now. Original brainstorming, yeah. So Scott, can you elaborate on that for a minute?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this webinar. This is very timely and very much of interest. So in terms of the tool being used to gather, assimilate data that's available, I think you mentioned through 2021 generally, assimilate, put those ideas together. There's always our original brainstorming that we do is ourselves and with our teams. Would this become sort of okay, we've used this as a tool and these are some ideas, would it begin to limit our brainstorming around those ideas, or what can we do such that it does not and is used for a tool only, and that we still take our expertise, experience, as you mentioned, and apply that to it and use it for the best outcomes?
Great question, Scott. A colleague here laments the fact that his kids can't read a map, and so he's just aghast that his son has been driving to his classes for 3 years now in high school. He still turns on Google Maps to get to the high school, and so there is a risk that we become too dependent on it. But I think like any new tool, I think there's things you can do from a human dynamic or group teamwork standpoint. What I've done in some of the groups I've worked on is let's brainstorm first just ourselves, and then let's use generative AI to build on that. Or use different AI tools. Let's use Bard and give it this prompt. Let's use ChatGPT and give it this prompt. Let's use Bing and give it a different prompt to try to crowdsource as many ideas as possible. But I think to your point, what you lose is kind of the specific domain or context if you're just broadly asking. And so that comes with, I think, just perpetually asking what's missing, what's going on. I've got an example coming up that I think may not prevent that, but can talk a little more about it.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
So of Ethan's approaches, I'm going to talk a little bit about coaching. And so one thing you'll notice about the early examples that I shared is that when I was just playing around with it, my prompts were very short. Can you do this? Can you do that? This, and I'll go through more detail, you don't need to read it, is a very lengthy prompt that Ethan wrote, made publicly available, that could be used to help students kind of coach a particular sequence. And so once that prompt is put into entered in, and you hit enter, the first thing you get back is, hello, I'm your coach. I'm here to help you reflect on your recent team experience. My role is not to lecture, but rather to guide you through a reflective process where we explore your experiences, challenges, successes, and learning moments. I believe this will help you grow as a team member and also personally. So let's get started. It asks the student to think about the recent team experience, asked the student to share a challenge they felt good about and a challenge they felt they could have done better at. And so in this use case, the student said, I overcame the challenge of not being able to delegate. I wasn't able to overcome the amount of anxiety I had. And then it gives us some feedback on that. And then it's a whole dialogue that goes on for about 10 or 12 back and forth, which you can do. I want to talk a little about the prompt. There's a structure around prompts if you get into long prompts. And so the first thing is you want to make sure you've got a role and a goal. You're telling the generative AI what you want it to do. So you can give it a persona. You want to tell it who it is and how it should behave. So you're a helpful, friendly coach, helping students reflect on the team experience, introduce yourself, explain what you're here as a coach to help them reflect on the experience. Then you want to tell the prompt the step-by-step instruction, explicitly what you want it to do. You want it to first ask the student to think about the experience and name one challenge they'd overcome and one challenge that they did not overcome, and then wait for a response. Once the student puts in the response, then ask the student to reflect on these challenges. How was your understanding of yourself as a team member changed? What new insights did you gain? So what this prompt is about is not giving someone the answer, and this would never replace a teammate or a real life coach, at least in the near term it wouldn't, but it may be useful to get people to start thinking about it. I know when I've asked students to reflect on an experience, unless I'm there to push them, they don't get very deep. They're pretty superficial. And so this is a way to at least give them the opportunity to go a little bit deeper. So we've given them the role and the goal, given them step-by-step instructions. We provided some constraints. You told it, where you don't want it to go astray. So don't respond until you get something from the student. Don't go ahead and share the plan with the students. Always wait for a response. And then, there's some pedagogy of what you want to do. Ask open-ended questions, push them, wrap up the conversation by praising reflective thinking, and then finally, push for reflection. So that's a pretty deep analysis. And I know the other thing that Malik recommends is that I predict, and maybe some of you've seen it already, people starting to, sell books of prompts, or, sign up for my newsletter and I'll give you prompts to do certain things. There's a real skill out there about designing prompts for using generative AI for specific use cases, whether it's marketing or teaching or coding, whatever that is. I think for the Center of Analytics Impact, actually, generative AI is going to create some opportunities because it's going to make people more productive, and the value that employees are going to be able to bring is more critical thinking, using these tools to better formulate problems, and then ultimately better communicate the results of their analysis, even if the analysis is done in part with an AI tool or on their own. So here's an example that I saw in Harvard Business Review. So maybe you've seen this. And this author was talking about how you might use ChatGPT to make better decisions. And the main point of the article is that it's not necessarily a good use to say, hey, I'm trying to decide whether or not my company should invest in AI. What do you think? It's using the AI to support a process where you're thinking about, how to frame the problem, how to identify alternatives, and ultimately the criteria by which you'd make the decision. So the way I'm thinking about it with my students, excuse the well-worn iceberg analogy. That's an iceberg if you can't tell. So if you think about icebergs, there's the part that's above the waterline. And I'm not a geologist, but usually what's above the waterline is a lot less than what's below the waterline. To make this analogy work, I'm a scuba diver, so I also mentioned the thermocline. Anyone else a scuba diver? Anyone know what a thermocline is? Anybody in marine biology? So if you've ever scuba dove, or if you're a regular swimmer, the thermocline is a point in the water where above it, the sun has heated that water, and below it, the sun hasn't gotten to it. So you can really notice it when you're swimming through it. There's a 10-degree difference between above the thermocline and below the thermocline. So I use that analogy to think about how at least beginners might use a generative AI tool. So some people see it as a replacement for search. I know people who no longer use Google, they use a generative AI. So any sort of question they have, instead of Googling it, they use generative AI. That's helpful, but I'm not sure they're using the full power of a generative AI. Then there are those that are using it as a replacement for Wikipedia. Tell me about why Germany lost the war. Tell me about Germany's role in the war, World War II. Again, great information. You got to be careful about hallucinations. But the real power is when you start thinking about it as your own personal assistant. Any Marvel Universe fans? The Marvel movies? Anyone know what Jarvis is? If you've seen Iron Man, Jarvis is Tony Stark's personal assistant. And as Ethan Mollick calls it, think of it as a very smart, somewhat naive, slightly alien, well-educated consultant. And so their example was, using better make decisions. It can be an external brain that helps managers structure their thoughts, gather data, and challenge their assumptions. It can be used for brainstorming, looking at multiple scenarios, and refining ideas. It cannot grasp the nuances of human emotion, ethics, and certain context-specific details, back to Scott's point. And over-reliance can lead to cognitive laziness, something to manage against. You should use it as a complementary tool, not as a replacement. A good decision has 3 steps: framing the problem, generating alternatives, and deciding between options. An AI like ChatGPT can help in all three steps without actually making the decision for you. It can provide information, analysis, perspectives to inform, can point out biases, challenge assumptions, and broaden thinking. So I'm going to show you an example how I tried to use that technique using ChatGPT. So my first question, I told, the role goal. I own a small business. We provide consulting services in marketing and strategy to consumer products companies. I'm learning about generative AI tools. I'm trying to decide if we should invest in staff and tools to use generative AI in our business. Help me frame the decision. What are the things that I should investigate and consider? And it gave me a list of 8 things that I want to think about as I'm evaluating whether or not I should decide what to do. So after that, digesting all that, I followed up with the question that is very helpful. What have other companies considered when looking at the same question? And so it spit back some ideas about how other companies might have, what criteria they may have used to look at it. And this is its output from looking at all that data. So there's a risk here that there may be something that includes that's not what other companies have used, but I know my business well enough, and I think I could filter that out. And then I followed up and said, can you provide some alternatives for me to consider in making the decision? So again, I think by using that process, I'm getting a richer partner in helping me think through things other than saying, hey, should I invest in generative AI as a company? So the advice from today's Washington Post, don't use chatbots for factual answers. Do use them to help you brainstorm. Don't ask a chatbot. Don't ask once and stop. Do know what they're best at, and don't get frustrated and give up. So I do have a few closing slides, but I want to stop to see if there's any questions that I've missed before I hit my couple closing slides. I tell my students when I first started teaching, someone gave me the advice that when I ask a question, I should wait for a 7 count before moving on. Ask the question 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. That's a really long time. 7 count. I'm one of the people that are uncomfortable with pauses. So this is my distraction while I wait to see if anyone's formulating a question or a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. Anything I've missed, anything that you hoped we covered, we can maybe perhaps cover in an additional webinar, or something that you thought I should have included that I haven't hit yet. Great question, Caroline. The answer is yes. I'm not sure what they are about AI programs targeting certain industries, but I think, as Richard mentioned, it's the Wild West out there, and companies are scrambling to provide kind of bespoke tools that are very targeted to a particular industry. I know that here at Wake, we probably get 2 or 3 inquiries a week about how this company is fine-tuned a large language model, and it really is going to help provide tutoring services to students. So I'm sure there's the equivalent in financial services, in marketing, in supply chain. I think, as Richard mentioned, in some cases, people may be building it in-house. In other cases, they might be trying to source it from third-party providers. All right. I want to reinforce that idea of don't get frustrated and give up. I don't really know where generative AI is going. I'm fully open to the idea that we're at the peak of that Gartner hype curve, and 8 months from now, my colleagues are going to look at me and say, weren't you foolish to be so excited about generative AI? And it'll be around, but it may not achieve the productivity potential that I think it is. There's even data that says use of ChatGPT has started to drop off a little bit. So who knows what's going to happen? One of the things I'm a little worried about is that some of them are no longer free. There is starting to be fees for some access to some of them. Some firms are following freemium model. I just saw that Claude, Anthropology, whatever the company is that owns Claude, is starting to think about a premium version. So from my perspective, from a student perspective, how do we take care of that in the classroom? They're the ones that are paying for access. They're going to give them advantage. So there are equity issues. So there are a lot of questions. But I do think whether it's a big idea or a little idea, it's going to be around for a while. And we're even starting to see it in job postings for our potential employees. Digital skills, can they write prompts? Can they ask the right questions? And this was back in January, but this idea of if you can write prompts well, at least in January, there were a lot of opportunities for that. I guess my closing thought is that this is a quote from Sam Altman. And his belief is that the marginal cost of intelligence and the marginal cost of energy are going to go to zero. I'm not sure about energy, but I think the cost of knowledge is going to go to zero, in the sense that with a smartphone and generative AI, information is no longer going to be of great value. It's going to be how you use that information. Because as long as we have a smartphone and some sort of generative AI tool, you can access all the information that you need, which is exciting, but also it creates a lot of risk. Like I said, I'm spent part of my career as a consultant, and one of the value propositions that we would add to our clients was our access to information that they didn't have access to. I think that's going to go away. And whether it goes away 2 years from now or 20 years from now, it's happened. So some of the implications of the cost of information going to zero is everybody knows everything, instantaneous access, the ability to ask for that information in natural language is going to remove a barrier. It used to be, you had to be a librarian to understand where things were stored, or you had to code a certain way to be able to extract things from different parts of the internet. But if you can ask for it in natural language, then it's going to change the equation of the balance of power. And what we hope, or what we think in the Center for Analytics Impact, is that, again, information is great, but asking the right question, the ability to structure the problem, and ultimately communicate whatever the analysis brings you are skills we're teaching our students, and hopefully will have dividends for our alumni as well as our students. So I'm at the end of my slides. Any burning questions anybody has? I will go back and collectively, we've got lots of expertise here. So if anyone has any particular questions that more specific on the technical side or in a particular industry, feel free to reach out to me or to Stacy, as my email on that slide, mckeensd@wfu.edu. But other than that, I will thank you for your time and turn it back over to Stacy if she has any parting comments or requests of you or of me.
Sure. Thanks so much for doing that. I always learn something new, and remind myself that I need to use it in my role as well, to try different things. So if you are interested in AI, we have 2 more workshops this semester. The next one being, it is sponsored by the Legacy Center for Leadership and Character at the School of Business, and it's ethical considerations using AI in your organization, and that is in October. We will have, and I'll follow up with you after this with the recording and include these other dates. And then the next one is using AI in your career search. So we know it's a hot topic. We want you to feel like you can come back to the School of Business and learn about contemporary topics. We're always open to suggestions you have for other topics in the future. But we thank everyone for being here today. Have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.